The Sharon Tate-LaBianca murders in August of '69 and the Gary Hinman murder in July of '69. These three sets of Manson-related killings, of course, are all connected. Yet, the Gary Hinman killing often gets overlooked when discussing the Manson murders. Yes, the Tate-LaBianca killings get most of the attention. Yet, it was the Gary Hinman killing which put everything else into motion. In this video, I'm going to take a look at all three sets of murders. The Gary Hinman killing and, of course, the Tate-LaBianca murders. Gary Hinman was not a member of the Manson family. However, he got caught up in Manson family drama thanks largely to Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby himself was not a quote-unquote official member of the Manson family, but he was close to Charles Manson. In late July of 1969, Bobby Beausoleil bought mescaline, a psychedelic drug from Gary Hinman. According to some sources, including CharlesManson.com, Bobby bought the mescaline for the Manson-associated Straight Satan's motorcycle gang. The leader of the motorcycle gang, Danny DiCarlo, was even living at the Manson family spawn ranch. The motorcycle gang, particularly Danny DiCarlo, were not happy with the quality of the drug Bobby Beausoleil bought them. Subsequently, Danny DiCarlo forced Bobby Beausoleil to go back to Gary Hinman's house and demand he return the money that was spent on the mescaline. Long story short, one thing led to another, and eventually, Manson himself showed up at Gary's house and slashed Gary across the face with a knife. Here's the massive irony. Bobby Beausoleil initially asked Gary Hinman for $1,000. When Hinman refused to give it to him, there was an argument, but Bobby and Gary did eventually come to an agreement about some sort of compensation for the bad mescaline. This included Gary giving Bobby both of his cars. So, just as all that got settled, Manson arrived and slashed Gary in the face, setting into motion a series of terrible events. If Manson was able to control his temper and his violent tendencies, a lot of things would have been different. After slashing Gary in the face, Manson subsequently left the house and dumped the problem on Bobby to deal with. Gary Hinman, understandably, wanted to go to a hospital to get his injury looked after, but Bobby tried to stop him. He was afraid that Gary might talk to authorities about everything. Eventually, Bobby killed Gary Hinman. Again, all of this started because the motorcycle gang forced Bobby to go back to Gary's house. The following is from CharlesManson.com. Quote, after Manson slashed Gary Hinman and left the house, Beausoleil eventually phoned Spawn Ranch and asked for advice on what to do. Manson came to the phone, told Beausoleil he was on his own, and hung up. Gary Hinman made additional demands to be allowed to go to the hospital. In a state of panic and desperation, Beausoleil made the decision to kill Hinman. Bobby stabbed Gary once in the chest. When Gary did not immediately fall, Bobby stabbed him a second time. In court testimony, the coroner said that the second stab wound was almost instantly fatal. At the crime scene, Bobby tried to make it look as though Hinman had been killed by someone else. Bobby drew the words "political pig" on the wall in Gary's blood. Bobby also painted an animal paw mark on the wall, supposedly to make it appear as though the Black Panthers did it. In a 1981 interview with Truman Capote, Bobby revealed that Gary Hinman stated he would disclose information about Manson attacking him. According to Bobby, that's why he killed him on July 27, 1969. A week and a half later, on August 6, 1969, Bobby was arrested in San Luis Obispo, about 3.5 hours north of Los Angeles. Bobby was driving one of Gary Hinman's vehicles. The car broke down on the freeway, and the knife used to kill Gary Hinman was in the car. End quote. The Gary Hinman murder essentially served as the quote-unquote blueprint for the Tate-LaBianca murders 2 weeks later. Death by knife stabbings and blood writings on the walls of the deceased. Manson killer Susan Atkins was present at Gary Hinman's house when Bobby Beausoleil killed him. There were actually 2 Manson girls present at Hinman's house when Bobby killed him, Susan Atkins and Mary Brunner. Mary was not involved in the Sharon Tate killings. Susan was. Early in the morning on August 9th, just 2 days after Bobby's arrest, Sharon Tate's house was attacked. Susan Atkins wrote the word pig on the front door of Sharon's house using Sharon's blood. Susan Atkins claimed she was inspired to do this because of what Bobby did at Gary's house. Remember, Bobby tried to frame the Black Panthers. Therefore, by doing the same type of blood writing at Sharon Tate's house, Susan and the other Manson family members were trying to make it seem as though the Panthers were also behind the Sharon Tate killings. If people learned that Sharon Tate was murdered by the Panthers in the same way Gary Hinman was killed by the Panthers, then Bobby Beausoleil would be viewed as innocent. It couldn't have been Bobby, it was the Black Panthers. This was the Manson family logic. Insane, but then again, the entire Manson family was insane. Bottom line, if you connect the dominoes, the Straight Satan's motorcycle gang set into motion the series of events which led to Gary Hinman's murder. The following is from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he explains in graphic detail what happened the night of the Tate-LaBianca killings. Quote, August 8, 1969. Late that night at the Spawn Movie Ranch near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, a man and 3 women got in a beat-up yellow 1959 Ford and headed towards Beverly Hills. A ranch hand heard one of the women say, "We're going to get some pigs." That woman was Susan Sadie Atkins, 21, who'd grown up mostly in San Jose. The daughter of 2 alcoholics, she said that her brother and his friends would often molest her. She had dropped out of high school and moved to San Francisco, where she'd worked as a topless dancer and gotten into LSD. "My family kept telling me, 'You're going downhill,'" she would later say. "So I just went downhill all the way to the bottom." Huddled beside her in the back of the car was Patricia Krenwinkel. 21, from Inglewood, Krenwinkel had developed a hormone problem as a kid, leading her to overeat and fear that she was ugly and unwanted. As a teen, she got into drugs and started to drink heavily. One day in 1967, she left her car in a parking lot, failed to collect the 2 paychecks from her job at an insurance company, and disappeared. In the passenger seat was Linda Kassabian, 20, from New Hampshire. She played basketball in high school, but she dropped out to get married. The union lasted less than 6 months. Not long after, in Boston, she was arrested in a narcotics bust. By the spring of 1968, she'd remarried, had a kid, and moved to Los Angeles. Sometimes she'd introduce herself as Yana the Witch. At the wheel was Charles Tex Watson, 23 and 6'3" from East Texas. Watson had been a Boy Scout and the captain of his high school football team. He'd sometimes help his dad, who ran a gas station and grocery store. At North Texas State University, he joined a fraternity and started getting stoned. Soon, he dropped out, moved to California, and got a job as a wig salesman. One day, he picked up a hitchhiker who turned out to be Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, a chance occurrence that changed both their lives forever. That night in August of 1969, in the yellow Ford, Tex, Susan, Patricia, and Linda were all dressed in black from head to toe. None of them had a history of violence. They were part of a hippie commune that called itself the Family and lived in isolation at the abandoned Spawn Ranch. More than anything, the family lived in accordance to the whims of their leader, the 34-year-old Charles Manson, who had commanded the 4 of them to take their trip that night in August. The 4 arrived at 150 Ciello Drive, where the actress Sharon Tate lived with her husband, the filmmaker Roman Polanski. Polanski was away in London at the time, scouting locations for The Day of the Dolphin, a movie in which a dolphin is trained to assassinate the President of the United States. The drive to Ciello would have taken about 40 minutes. It was just after midnight when they arrived. It was quiet there, seemingly worlds away from the hustle and sprawl of Los Angeles. The Tate House, built in 1942, had belonged to a French actress who'd modeled it on the Norman country estates of her youth. This beautiful house sat on 3 acres of isolated land nestled against a hillside. From this house, you could see views of Los Angeles glittering to the east and Bel Air's Folsom estates unfurling to the west. On a clear day, you could see straight to the Pacific 10 miles out. Anyways, Tex Watson scaled a pole to sever the phone lines to the house. Tex had been here before, and he knew where to find them right away. There was an electric gate leading to the driveway, but instead of activating it, the 4 elected to jump over an embankment and drop onto the main property. All of them were carrying buck knives. Watson also had a .22 buntline revolver. Kassabian remained on the outskirts, keeping watch. The other 3 crept up the hill toward the secluded estate. At the top of the driveway, they found Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was there visiting the caretaker in the guest house to sell him a clock radio. He was sitting in his dad's white car, having already rolled his window down to activate the gate control. Tex approached the driver's side of the car and pointed his gun at Stephen's face. "Please don't hurt me. I won't say anything," Stephen screamed, raising his arm to protect himself. Tex slashed his left hand with the knife, slicing through the strap of his wristwatch. Then he shot Parent 4 times. In his arm, his left cheek, and twice in the chest. Parent died instantly, his blood beginning to pool in the car. Those 4 shots rang out through the air, but no one in the house at 150 Ciello seemed to hear them. It was a rustic home of stone and wood. Finding no open windows or doors, Tex cut a long horizontal slit in a window screen outside the dining room and gained entry into the house. He went to the front door to let Atkins and Krenwinkel in. In the living room, the 3 killers came across Wojtek Frykowski, a 32-year-old Polish émigré and an aspiring filmmaker, asleep on the couch with an American flag draped over it. Rubbing his eyes to make out the figures clad in black and standing over him, Wojtek stretched his arms and, apparently mistaking the Manson family for friends, asked them, "What time is it?" Tex aimed his gun at Wojtek and said, "Be quiet, don't move, or you're dead." Wojtek stiffened, the gravity of the situation beginning to seize him. "Who are you?" he asked, "and what are you doing here?" "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business," Tex replied, kicking Wojtek in the head. Susan Atkins then found a towel and used it to bind Wojtek's hands as best as she could. Then, on Tex's instructions, she looked through the house, searching for others. She came to a bedroom where she saw a woman reclining on a bed, reading. Abigail Folger, 25, the heiress to a coffee fortune. She'd been staying at the house with Wojtek, who was her boyfriend since April. Now, she glanced up from her book, smiled, and waved at Atkins, not realizing the danger. For her part, Atkins responded in kind and continued down the hall. Crazy. Atkins peered into a second bedroom, where a man sat on the edge of a bed talking to a pregnant woman who lay there in lingerie. The man, Jay Sebring, 35, was a hairstylist. His shop in Beverly Hills attracted a wealthy, famous clientele. He'd been the first one to cut hair in a private room as opposed to a barber shop. He'd served in the Navy during the Korean War. An intensely secretive man, he was rumored to allow only 5 people to keep his phone number. On the bed with him was his ex-girlfriend, Sharon Tate, then 26 and 8.5 months pregnant with her first child. She'd recently filmed her biggest role to date in 13 Chairs, and her manager had promised she'd be a star someday. Born in Dallas, Texas, Tate was the daughter of an Army officer. She grew up in cities scattered across the globe. Her beauty was such that she'd apparently stopped traffic, literally, on her first visit to New York. She'd been a homecoming queen and a prom queen. Even at 6 months old, she'd won a Miss Tiny Tot contest in Texas. A film career, she hoped, would get her noticed for something beyond her good looks. There, on Ciello Drive, at the home she called the Love House, Tate was optimistic about her future. She believed her child would strengthen her marriage with Polanski, who sometimes demeaned her. Now, having reported back to Tex, Susan retied Wojtek's hands with a piece of nylon rope. She went to bring the others into the living room, returning with Folger at knife point, and then with Sebring and Tate. "Come with me," she told them. "Don't say a word, or you're dead." In their shock and confusion, they offered the intruders money and whatever else they wanted, begging them not to hurt anyone. Tex ordered the 3 who'd come from their bedrooms to lie face down on their stomachs in front of the fireplace. Sharon Tate began to cry. Tex told her to shut up. Taking a long rope, he tied Sebring's hands behind his back and ran a length around his neck. He looped the rope around Tate's neck next and then Folger's, throwing the rest of it over a beam in the ceiling. Sebring struggled to his feet and protested. Couldn't this man see that Tate was pregnant? He tried to move towards Sharon, and Tex shot him, puncturing a lug. Sebring crumbled onto the zebra skin rug by the fireplace. Since they were all tied together, his collapse forced the screaming Tate and Folger to stand on their toes, to keep them from being strangled. Tex dropped to his knees and began stabbing the hairstylist incessantly. Standing up again, he kicked Sebring in the head. Then he told Krenwinkel to turn off all the lights. "What are you going to do to us?" Sharon Tate asked. "You're all going to die," Tex said. Wojtek had managed to free his hands. He lunged towards Atkins, attempting to disarm her. But she forced her knife into his legs, stabbing him constantly as they rolled across the living room floor, a tangle of limbs glinting with steel. He pulled her long hair, his blood spraying everywhere, and he'd been stabbed more than 6 times. But Wojtek staggered to his feet. Atkins had lost her knife, so he made a run for the front door, and with Atkins still pummeling him, got as far as the lawn. Tex shot him with 2 bullets and then tackled him to the ground, pounding the butt of his gun against the back of his head again and again. He hit him with such force that Wojtek's skull cracked. Inside, Sharon was sobbing. Then Folger, who lifted the noose from her neck, ran down the hall and out the house through a side door. She was halfway across the front lawn when Krenwinkel caught up to her and brought her knife down, stabbing her 28 times. Tex joined in and Folger went limp, saying, "I give up. I'm already dead." Drenched in blood and their own sweat, the two killers rose to see Wojtek yet again on his feet stumbling towards them. Soon, they were stabbing him with the same mechanical precision, forcing steel through flesh, bone, and cartilage. The coroner tallied 51 stab wounds to Wojtek, plus 13 blows to the head and 2 bullet wounds. Atkins had remained in the house with Sharon, who was whimpering, sitting on the floor, still only in lingerie and bound by the neck to the dead body of her former lover, Jay Sebring. She was the only one still alive. She was due to give birth to the child, a boy, in 2 weeks. Tex came back inside and ordered Atkins to kill her. Tate begged her to spare her life, to spare her unborn child. "I want to have my baby," she said. "Woman, I have no mercy for you," Atkins responded, locking her arm around Tate's neck from behind. "You're going to die, and I don't feel anything about it." She stabbed her in the stomach. Tex joined in, and the pair stabbed her 16 times until she cried out for her mother and died. Atkins dipped her fingers into one of Tate's wounds and tasted her blood. It was, quote, "warm, sticky, and nice," she'd later recall. "To taste death and yet give life," she said. Wow, what a trick. She soaked a towel in Tate's blood and brought it to the front door, where, following Tex's instruction to write something that would shock the world, she scrawled the word pig. Their work was done. When Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel and Kassabian returned to the Spawn Ranch early that morning, they went to their beds and slept soundly. "I was gone," Atkins later recalled. "It was like I was dead. I could not think about anything. It was almost as if I passed out, blacked out. My head was blank. There was nothing in me. It was like I had given it all." At 150 Ciello Drive was a scene of such callous, barbarous devastation that it shook something loose in the national psyche. August 8th and August 9th suddenly seemed to describe different realities. Media accounts were quick to infer something more sordid than ordinary homicide, something occult had occurred. One paper called the murders a, quote, bloody orgy. Others reported ritualistic slayings and overtones of a weird religious rite. The facts were unavailable or misreported. Maybe drugs were involved. Maybe they weren't. Maybe Sebring had been wearing a black hood of a Satanist. Maybe he hadn't. The big picture was one of supernatural ruin. An officer at the scene said the bodies looked like mannequins dipped in red paint. Another said, "It's like a battlefield up there." Pools of blood had soaked into the carpets. According to Time magazine, stray bullets were lodged in the ceiling. In Roman Polanski, whose films were errantly, even proudly occultist, the public found someone onto whom it could project its fatalism. A popular press account said that mere minutes before he learned of the murders, Polanski, at a party in London, had been discussing a friend's death. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo," he said. "Who will be the next to go?" With that, the phone rang and he was summoned to hear that his wife and friends had been brutally murdered. But it wasn't over. The next night at the Spawn Ranch, the same group convened with 3 additions. There was 18-year-old Stephen Grogan, a musician and high school dropout, and the 19-year-old Leslie Van Houten, a former homecoming princess from the suburbs of Los Angeles. And then there was Charles Manson, their leader. The 7 of them piled into the beat-up Ford on a search for more victims. After nearly 3 hours of restive driving through Los Angeles and its environs, Manson finally settled on a home in Los Feliz, at 3301 Waverly Drive, next door to a house he'd once stayed in. Manson broke into the house by himself, armed with a pistol and a knife. Others maintained that he brought Tex Watson with him. In any case, he spotted LaBianca, 44 years old, a grocery store owner, asleep on the couch. Leno's wife, Rosemary, 38 years old, was in the bedroom. Rosemary was paranoid that people had been breaking in and moving their furniture around lately, and, like the whole city, she was spooked by the Tate murders the previous night. Even so, Manson was apparently able to walk right in through an unlocked door, and he tied up the couple by himself. Then, Manson rejoined his followers at the bottom of the long driveway, where they were waiting in the car. Manson chose Tex and Krenwinkel again as his executioners. This time he added Van Houten to the mix too. She'd never so much as struck a person before that night. Regardless, he told the three of them to go inside and kill everyone. They had only buck knives. They burst into the house, separated the couple, and stabbed Leno 26 times. They carved the word war into his stomach and impaled a carving fork beside it, its handle jutting out of his belly. And they left a steak knife protruding from his neck. Rosemary suffered 41 stab wounds, many inflicted after she'd already died. Before they left, the killer scrawled "Helter Skelter" in blood on the refrigerator, a reference to the Beatles song Helter Skelter, though they misspelt it. On the walls, they smeared "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" in Leno's blood. The bloodshed in its primitive defiance, a pregnant star slaughtered, a man punctured with kitchen utensils, confirmed a sense of rupture in America. The 60s subversive spirit had come on with too much fervor. Some reckoning was bound to happen, or so it seemed in retrospect. The nation was immured in these events, in the motive, the manhunt, and then in 1970, the sensational 9.5-month-long trial. But after the murders, Manson and his followers were not brought to justice for nearly 4 months. With the suspects unknown and at large, rumors proliferated and the tension reached a fever pitch. For a while, the police maintained that the two sets of murders, the LaBianca Tate murders, were unrelated. They claimed the LaBiancas were the victims of a copycat attack. As days turned into weeks and weeks to months, two separate teams of LAPD detectives, one assigned to Tate, the other to the LaBiancas, failed to share information, believing that the crimes were unconnected. As they lost valuable time pursuing false leads, doubt and ridicule followed them in the press. For almost 4 months, the police would say that they had no real idea who had committed the murders, some of the most appalling murders in the history of the country. As journalist Joan Didion famously stated, the 60s abruptly ended on August 9, 1969. The tension broke that day. The paranoia was fulfilled. There's a germ of truth in what she said, but the process wasn't so abrupt. It began that day, but it wasn't over really until December 1st, 1969. The day the police announced the crimes had been solved and the nation got its first glimpse of the killers. Here was the final fulfillment of that paranoia, the last gasp of 60s idealism. At LAPD headquarters, the chief of police, Edward M. Davis, stepped up to an array of 15 microphones and announced to a stunned crowd of 200 reporters that the case was solved. Warrants were out for Charles Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kassabian. More people would be named pending grand jury indictments. Davis added, to everyone's astonishment, that the Tate-LaBianca murders were connected. The suspects may have been responsible for a series of other unresolved homicides too. Police Chief Davis didn't name Manson or Susan Atkins that day because they were already in custody. In mid-October, Manson, with a welter of his followers, had been apprehended on auto theft charges at the Barker Ranch, a hideaway in the forbidding Death Valley, several hours away from Los Angeles. Its seclusion surpassed even that of the Spahn Ranch. Atkins had been charged with another unrelated murder, that of Gary Hinman, an old friend of Manson. She was being held at the Sybil Brand Institute, a jail for women in Los Angeles County, where she bragged to cellmates about her complicity in the Tate murders. Those offhand remarks broke the case open for the LAPD, who began to connect the dots they'd been staring at for nearly 4 months. Journalists dug into the story. Images of Manson and the family were emblazoned on front pages and TV screens around the world. The cognitive dissonance was intense. These weren't the faces of hardened criminals or escaped lunatics. They were hippies, stereotypical flower children. In the bloom of wide-eyed youth, the men unshaven and long-haired, wearing beads and buckskin jackets. The women in blue jeans and tie-dyed tops, no bras, and their hair tangled and unwashed. They talk like hippies, too, spouting an ethos of free love, eschewing monogamy and marriage in favor of sexual experimentation. They lived in roaming communes, caravanning along the Golden Coast in Technicolor bright buses and clunkers cobbled together from spare parts. They believed that hallucinations strengthened the spirit and expanded the mind. They gave birth naturally and raised their children together in rustic simplicity. In other ways, though, their philosophy was Gnostic, verging on theological. Time did not exist, they proclaimed. There was no good, no bad, and no death. All human beings were God and the devil at the same time and part of one another. The family's moral code, insofar as it existed at all, was riven with contradictions. While it was wrong to kill animals according to their philosophy, even the snakes and spiders in their bunkhouses had to be carefully spared. It was fine to kill people, because, according to them, human life was inherently valueless. To kill a person was tantamount to, quote, breaking off a minute piece of some cosmic cookie, as Tex Watson later put it. If anything, according to their philosophy, death was something to be embraced, because it exposed your soul to the oneness of the universe. Where had these beliefs come from? The murderers had been raised and educated for the most part in solid conventional American communities. So what happened? The promise of the hippie movement had been in its willingness to forego cherished institutions in favor of the new and untested. The Manson family, with its starry-eyed communalism, sexual frankness, and veneration of LSD, offered a screen onto which anyone could project his insecurities about the era's politics and pressures. After the Tate murders, it seemed that hippies and freaks were more than a risible sideshow. They could really undermine the status quo. Their promiscuity had always earned a lot of finger-wagging from concerned moralists, while others had looked on with thinly veiled envy. Parents were worried about their kids that they would drop out, become hippies, and never get decent jobs. Everywhere, kids were hitchhiking. The consensus from the quote-unquote straight world was that hippies were mostly harmless, but you didn't want to be one. While there had been isolated incidents of violence attributed to hippies, none of it was as horrific, premeditated, or systematic as the murders committed by the Manson family. On December 12th, a piece in Time magazine drew parallels between hippies and violence. In the movement's Invitation to Freedom, the magazine warned, criminals and psychotics blossomed as easily as innocents and pacifists did. But how, Time asked, could children who had dropped out for the sake of kindness and caring, love and beauty, end up killing? End quote. This is one of the main arguments that the author Tom O'Neill is making with this book. I'm not really giving anything away here because he's done several interviews about this, where he discusses that his theory is that what happened with the Mansons wasn't some sort of random act, but rather Manson was a CIA asset, and that these murders were meant to put a massive stain on the hippie movement, because the government considered the hippie movement a threat in many regards. I'm paraphrasing here essentially, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically, this is one of the main arguments Tom O'Neill makes. Why did Manson kill Sharon Tate? The killings at Ciello Drive on August 9, 1969 were not physically done by Manson, but the murders were done under his orders. So why did he order these killings, and specifically, why Sharon Tate? First, I'm going to tell you the mainstream narrative as to why these murders happen, and then I'm going to share with you what many people believe is the actual story. So, the mainstream narrative of the story is that Sharon Tate, along with the other victims, were not deliberately targeted, but rather they were collateral damage. The prevailing mainstream story as to why Manson targeted the house on Ciello Drive is because that's where record producer Terry Melcher was living. Charles Manson had a close relationship with Terry Melcher, and on various occasions, Manson and some of his followers actually spent time at the house on Ciello Drive. For his part, Terry Melcher had visited Spawn Ranch, the infamous hippie commune near Chatsworth, Los Angeles, where Manson and his followers were living. Terry was considering signing Manson to a record deal, but when the record deal never happened, Manson took his revenge by attacking Melcher's house. Therefore, according to this version of the story, it was irrelevant who was actually killed in Terry Melcher's home on Ciello Drive, because the point wasn't about targeting any one specific person, but rather killing anyone who happened to be in the house as a message to Terry. According to the mainstream narrative, Manson didn't even know Terry Melcher didn't live at the house anymore. During the Manson hearings the following year in 1970, Terry Melcher stated that after the murders, he had never met with Manson ever again. Now, as the years have gone by, more and more people have begun to challenge the mainstream story regarding the Manson murders. First and foremost, Manson was aware that Terry Melcher didn't live at that house on Ciello Drive anymore. The idea that Manson didn't know he wasn't there isn't true. Terry also said he never met Manson again after the murders. However, journalist Tom O'Neill was able to prove that Terry Melcher did in fact meet with Charles Manson not just once, but multiple times after the killings. Tom O'Neill's findings proved that Melcher did lie about this in court. As a matter of fact, Tom O'Neill has stated that he did approach Terry Melcher regarding his findings. According to Tom, Terry Melcher was livid that he was going to publish this information. Bottom line, given how much of the Manson story has been proven to be false, could it be that the Mansons did specifically target Sharon Tate? According to Tom and various others, the Manson family did actually plan to kill Sharon Tate and her friends at least on one other occasion. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frykowski were 4 of the victims killed on August 9, 1969 by the Manson family. Infamously, when the Manson family invaded the Sharon Tate house on August 9th, the first thing Manson follower Tex Watson did was cut the phone lines. Now, with that kept in mind, something eerily similar happened on another occasion. According to Tom O'Neill and various others, Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wojtek were hanging out at another house not long before August 9th. As the 4 friends were hanging out, the lights in that house started to act weird. It was later discovered that someone had cut power lines connected to that house. None of this is a conspiracy, by the way. This pre-August 9th incident 100% happened. But the question is, why and who? Who cut the power lines? The prevailing theory here is that the Manson family did intend on killing Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wojtek on this occasion, but they cut the wrong lines and bailed. That part hasn't been proven, but it's certainly a pretty big coincidence that something like this would happen to Sharon and her friends briefly before they were murdered in a disturbingly similar circumstance. The deeper you dig into the Manson story, the more you come across these weird coincidences. Tom O'Neill and others argue that this pre-August 9th incident does strongly suggest the Manson family was targeting Sharon Tate and her friends specifically. I personally agree with that. I do think Sharon Tate and her circle of friends were specifically targeted. But again, the question is why? There are many theories as to what the motive may have been to kill Sharon Tate, but up to this point, at least not publicly, there is no definitive answer as to why Sharon and her friends were specifically targeted. Some people believe Sharon Tate's husband, Roman Polanski, may have had a hand in this. Personally, I don't think he had anything to do with Sharon's murder, but to be clear, Polanski was a very abusive husband to Sharon Tate, and that's why some people think he may have been involved in the murder in some capacity. Regarding Polanski's abusive behavior, for instance, it's well documented that when Sharon Tate told Polanski she was pregnant, Polanski demanded she get an abortion. When Sharon didn't agree to have an abortion, Roman ditched Sharon in Los Angeles and flew out to London. In London, Roman had a very public affair with Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Michelle was a friend of Sharon's. Ditching your pregnant wife in another country and publicly cheating on your pregnant wife with her friend, that's not exactly a healthy relationship. Then, after the murders, police in Los Angeles found video of Polanski forcing Sharon Tate into having threesomes. As a matter of fact, Roman Polanski was known to show sex tapes of Sharon to his house guests. Polanski has a very disturbing sexual history. Most notably, of course, in 1977, Roman Polanski raped a 13-year-old girl in the U.S. That's why he permanently fled the United States for France in order to avoid the legal consequences. Bottom line, Polanski was both emotionally and sexually abusive towards Sharon Tate. According to the film, Jay Sebring, Cutting to the Truth, Sharon Tate was actually planning on divorcing Polanski. This film was made by Jay Sebring's nephew, Anthony DiMaria. In the film, an attorney says that he met with Sharon Tate regarding getting a divorce between her and Polanski. This same attorney felt certain that Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were still in love, which quite frankly would make sense. Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate stayed very close even after they broke up. It wouldn't have been hard to imagine they were still in love. Now, this divorce rumor has never been confirmed, but I do think it's likely true. Sharon wanted a traditional monogamous relationship, a marriage with Roman Polanski in the old-fashioned way. But Polanski still wanted to live a swinger lifestyle. On the 50th anniversary of Sharon Tate's death, August 9, 2019, the Washington Post wrote an article about Sharon. In that article, the Washington Post reported that apparently, if Polanski didn't change his behavior in the first 2 weeks after the baby was born, Sharon Tate intended to divorce him. I want to emphasize that this was reported by a major news outlet, the Washington Post. Now, obviously, major news outlets get things wrong all the time. However, I still think it's noteworthy that the Washington Post would publish an article in which they state Sharon Tate was strongly considering a divorce. The reason this is noteworthy to me is because in the mainstream narrative of Sharon Tate's life, there's no mention whatsoever that she was strongly considering divorcing Polanski. Again, these are the reasons some people think Polanski may have had a hand in the murders. As I said before, I personally don't think he was involved, but when reporting on a story, if you're trying to be honest in your reporting, it's important to showcase why people feel the way they do about certain things. Polanski's very abusive behavior towards Sharon Tate does condemn him in the eyes of many people who think he had a hand in the tragedy. Now, regarding the movie Jay Sebring's nephew made, I came across this following review. Quote, "In the film that Jay Sebring's nephew made about his uncle, an attorney stated that Sharon had him file divorce papers to end her marriage to Polanski. Unfortunately, Sharon was murdered before Polanski could be served with the documents. Polanski wanted Sharon to go to Brazil to have an abortion. She refused. At this point, Polanski verbally abused her, even in front of her friends. Then, he cheated on her. After the murders, the LAPD found a video in the Ciello Drive house of Polanski, forcing Sharon into threesomes. While Jay Sebring was trying to save Sharon's life, Polanski was in London having yet another affair. Sharon, at least in the beginning, tolerated Polanski's infidelity. She loved him so much that she looked the other way. In the last months of Sharon's life, however, it bothered her immensely that he was being unfaithful to her. Of course, years after Sharon's death, Polanski infamously raped a 13-year-old girl in 1977. He fled to France to escape a prison sentence in the United States. About 15 years later, he raped a woman in France. Polanski has made it known that he likes young girls, and it's believed that he sexually assaulted other women in France as well." End quote. Now, going back specifically to the Manson murders, as mentioned, I do believe, based on the information uncovered by Tom O'Neill, that Sharon Tate and her friends were specifically targeted. But again, the question is why? If only Tex Watson, Manson's main assassin, was on record clarifying what had actually happened. Well, actually, he might be. Tom O'Neill discovered that there's about 20 hours of audio tape of Tex Watson discussing everything. However, due to multiple legal complications, those tapes have been kept locked away despite multiple efforts to get them released. Hopefully one day those tapes do surface and we get some more clarity as to why these murders happened. One hypothetical question that gets thrown around from time to time is, what if Sharon Tate was never killed? What if the Manson murders never happened? Well, spoiler alert, director Quentin Tarantino touched on this subject in his film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. At the end of that film, the would-be Manson murderers were the ones who got killed. Sharon Tate and her friends all survived, and that's where the film ends. As of this posting on August 9th, 2025, which is the 56th anniversary of the Sharon Tate murders, director David Fincher is in the process of making a sequel to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This sequel will focus on Cliff Booth, Brad Pitt's character from the first film. David Fincher has directed Brad Pitt in 3 other major movies: Seven, Fight Club, and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. There are rumors that in this follow-up to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Margot Robbie may return in some capacity as Sharon Tate. Again, at this point, these are just rumors, but it would certainly be interesting to see how they would portray Sharon Tate in a timeline based after the Manson murders. If Sharon Tate had lived, would she have become a massive star? Would she have divorced Polanski and married Jay Sebring? There are so many what-ifs about the situation. And in the bigger picture of things, how would society be different if the Manson murders never happened? The murders sent shockwaves through society, and for many people, these killings destroyed the romantic image of the hippie movement. Hippies were supposed to be about peace and love, not murder. Well, according to a lot of people, that was actually the point. Many people believe that Manson was some sort of a CIA MKUltra asset, and that the plan was for him to orchestrate a series of horrific murders in order to turn public opinion against the hippie movement. Why? Because the hippies were against the war in Vietnam and many other key issues to the government. I'll be doing a deeper dive into that subject in another video.